So we thought about voter behavior, voter psychology, and we thought at this point it would be really important for us to hear from one of the eminent political scientists in the country about how voters actually do learn in elections. So please join me in welcoming Mark Hansen.
So, good afternoon. I'm here, I think, mostly to sort of tell you a little bit about what social scientists have learned in 60 plus years of looking at elections. So we have had very, very good data on voters and about voter decisions and voter choice over about a 60-year period, starting in the 1950s with the evolution of mass surveys. And there's been an awful lot of work by social scientists to try to understand how voters make decisions in elections. The way that political scientists and other social scientists have tended to think about this problem is that the voter decision process is a learning process. And the question then is, how do voters acquire and use the information that they receive, from campaigns on the one hand, and from the coverage of those campaigns on the other. And over the course of 60 years then, I think we've learned an awful lot about what that process looks like. So what I want to do today is to give you what I will distill down to kind of the four main lessons to be learned from 60 plus years of academic study of elections, about how voters make decisions, how they acquire information in elections, and then I want to talk a little bit too about what some of the implications of that process might be. So let me start with kind of four lessons that we might take away from this literature. The first lesson is that as we think about voters, the very important thing to recognize straight off, and I think many people in this room would already do that, but it's worth reminding ourselves, is that voters are not blank slates. So voters begin in an election season actually with an awful lot of information, and in many ways the most important information is already available to them before the election even starts. So they have information about the partisanship of the candidates, and they have their own partisanship. And in point of fact, that is, as we've already heard, probably the main determinant of the way that people make decisions in elections is they simply choose the candidate of their own party. So they already know that. They have a kind of standing rule that I support the candidate of the Republican Party or I support the candidate of the Democratic Party, and that's all the information they really need to know. A second thing that they already know is that they have 4+ years of experience with the incumbent, or 4+ or even more years of experience with the two political parties in office. So they have as well a kind of sense of the performance of the incumbent, a sense of the performance of the incumbent party in the government. And so they're starting as well with impressions themselves about whether they liked what's been happening for the last several years or whether they don't like what's been happening for the last several years. And then finally, another kind of key element in all of this is that they know whether they know the candidate already or not. So there's an enormous difference between elections that include an incumbent and elections that don't include an incumbent. The incumbency advantage in presidential elections turns out to be as large as the incumbency advantage in other elections, both congressional elections and gubernatorial elections. It's at least 4 percentage points of the popular vote on average. So incumbency is kind of an enormous amount of information that people have already. It's not clear exactly what's behind the incumbency effect, but at least part of it is that one of the things that voters are looking for as they evaluate candidates is, can I imagine this person holding this office? And it's very easy to imagine somebody holding the office when they already do hold the office. It's easy to look presidential when you get off of Air Force One, you go behind a podium that has the seal of the United States on it, and people address you as Mr. President. It's not hard to imagine that you know what it's like to be president. And it's much harder to imagine what somebody else might be in that situation. So the first lesson is that the voters know a lot already. They're not blank slates. They're not starting from nothing. And in fact, the most important influences on elections are already pretty much baked into the election before the election campaign even starts. Second conclusion from 60 plus years of research on voters is that voters only intermittently pay attention to campaigns. And most of what happens in the campaign as a result has little effect on their choices. And the reason why most voters aren't paying attention is because they don't need to. For many voters, they've already decided how they're going to vote, and so they're pretty much impervious to any additional information about what's going on in the election campaign. For many other voters, they don't have to make a choice yet because it's not ready yet. If they're in a primary, they may have a primary that's 6 or 12 weeks away. They might have a primary that's even a few months away. And even in the general election, many people really aren't engaged in thinking about the decision until they really have to make it. That is, aren't really engaged with the decision until well into October. So a lot of the campaign coverage is playing to voters who really aren't paying a whole heck of a lot of attention. Third conclusion from 60 plus years of study of voters in elections is that even though voters are intermittently attentive, over the course of the campaign, voters learn a great deal about the candidates and the issues. Campaigns, it turns out, are enormously informative. They're enormously informative even though most people are receiving information about those campaigns in a pretty passive mode. They're not seeking it out, it's just sort of washing over them. The important thing in campaigns is kind of the nature of the information that people are receiving. Some campaigns, presidential campaigns for instance, there is a very strong there's a kind of two flows of information. Information from one candidate, information from the other candidate. That is, there's a kind of competitive process in the information gathering and information dissemination activities of campaigns, which contrasts especially with House races and other kind of lower attention races where the candidates may not be so evenly matched and where you get a one-sided rather than a two-sided flow of information. But in a two-sided flow of information, there's a lot of information that gets produced because each campaign has an incentive to bring up its strong points and to bring up the weak points of the opposition, and they move back and forth as a result. One of the things that we've learned about the kind of information that's effective is that, in fact, negative advertising is actually more informative than positive advertising. That is, voters actually use negative more easily, and it's because of the nature of the messages that come about with negative advertising. They're much more likely to draw contrast. Negative advertising is much more likely to draw contrast between the candidates, for instance. And so negative advertising turns out to be very informative. Second implication is the intermittent attention and the learning over time is that the impact of new information, whether it's positive or negative, is much more limited the further the campaign goes along. So new information is very informative, very, very useful to voters early on in the campaign, and each additional piece of information means less and less and less to them. And then finally, the outcome of the election is seldom as much in doubt as the swings in the polls would seem to indicate. So again, this is kind of a consequence of intermittent attention, particularly early on in the campaigns when people aren't paying a great deal of attention. A pollster calls them up and says, "Who are you planning to vote for?" They haven't given it a moment's thought until that instant. And so what they say is they say the first thing that comes to their heads, just right off the top of their heads, and what's on the top of their minds is kind of what they've been hearing in the media for the last few days. So particularly early on in the campaign, the kind of public opinion polls are really more representative of what's been going on in the media than they are of what people's preferences are. And what we find is that as people learn over time, in fact, their preferences become more defined. Additional information is less useful to them because they have an accumulation of information that is useful to them. So I've been asked to kind of move through this kind of quickly so we can have some questions and answers. So let me then move to a little bit on what some of the implications of this view of voters as intermittently attentive, of information as something that has great value and great impact early and much less impact as the campaign goes along. What are some of the implications? Well, the major implication is that every event that happens in a campaign, whether it's the campaign's activities themselves or whether there are events that happen alongside those campaigns that might affect those campaigns, every event is part of a process. And so to understand that process, to understand the impact of that event, you have to take the long view of the process. And there are two processes I think that are important here. The first is a historical process. So even though every election is unique, there are in fact strong recurrent patterns in elections. And if you're not sort of attentive to those patterns, it's going to be kind of difficult to have an idea about what's going on and why it's going on. This is actually a point of view that is, I think, more widely appreciated now, particularly because of the efforts of people like Nate Silver, who actually incorporate information from the previous elections in order to have an understanding of what's likely to happen in the coming election. So every election is unique, but those kind of recurrent patterns, things like partisanship and things like the condition of the economy and foreign affairs and things like incumbency and things like the relative party policy positions of the two candidates, Those kind of things set real limits on what can happen. And so during the course of the campaign, there are events that move support for a candidate up or move support for a candidate down. But in the end, it all gets focused on a kind of range of possibilities that are really determined by these electoral fundamentals that don't have anything to do with actually what happened in the campaign. They're determined entirely outside the campaign. They're part of the historical context of the campaign. And so my favorite example of this of all time is some of you may remember that Walter Mondale briefly enjoyed a big boom in the polls in 1984 after Ronald Reagan got lost on the Pacific Coast Highway in his closing statement during one of the debates. And so there was an enormous boom for Mondale. Oh my gosh, it was very exciting because there wasn't much excitement in that campaign. And so all of a sudden, Mondale looks like he's reviving. There was never a hope for Walter Mondale. There was never a hope from the moment he began his campaign to the very end. And there was no more hope after that event than there was before. Second element of process that one needs to bear in mind is the learning process. So there's a learning process that goes on in both stages of the presidential and, for that matter, congressional and state level elections. There's a process at the primary level, and there's a process at the general election level. In the primaries, the important thing is happening. There are two things that are happening. One is learning is happening. The other thing that's happening is the choice set is changing. And so voters are making decisions about different choice objects, if you will, different candidates as the campaign progresses. As I've already mentioned, new information, particularly in primaries, has the greatest impact early. And then the value of that information diminishes as things go along. In primaries, particularly in the early primaries, we observe something I call the flavor of the month phenomenon, which is that new candidates come in. Okay, there's a big rush of enthusiasm about them. Think Herman Cain, for instance. There's a big rush of enthusiasm for them, and then they go crash and burn. And why do they go crash and burn? Well, when the candidates first enter, the only thing that voters know about them is that they're not the guy that they have some doubts about. Okay, they're not this sort of leading candidate where they know a fair bit about them, and there are things that they like about them and things they don't like about them. And so voters tend to project what they want to see onto the new candidates. And over time, they learn that, in fact, Herman Cain does not stand for the kinds of things that they stand for, or they learn that Herman Cain is not the vibrant and enticing personality they thought he was. And so over time, as they acquire more information, those kind of initial enthusiasms get diminished. So early on in the primaries, but also early on in the general elections, there's new information that comes in. But the important thing about that is that it is then superseded by new information. And that information then by new information. And that new information might either reinforce or it might counteract the effect of the earlier information. But with each successive wave of information, people get more and more set in their views, more and more set in their perceptions, more and more set in their preferences, and less susceptible to the influence of additional information. So that's the accumulation of information. By and large, by the end of the election, even the most inattentive voters actually have a lot of information about the candidates and about the issues. So by the end of a campaign, preferences are a lot more set, they're a lot less susceptible to change. And so the story really, over the course of the campaign, is people acquiring information, evaluating it relative to the information that they already have, okay, and then either sort of accepting that information and adapting their preferences and their perceptions to that information, or rejecting it based on their own kind of partisan predispositions, or rejecting it based on what they know from previous information. So in fact, people over the course of campaigns get information, and that is what helps them to make up their minds. So that's a kind of quick view of information and kind of what we know a little bit about voter information, and I'm happy to open things up for questions.
Mark, if I could ask a question about, so how do you think about the so-called October surprise?
Yeah.
In that context of diminishing impact of information?
Well, the October surprise would tend to be something that, I mean, the concern that campaigns have about it is that something will happen that an incumbent will be blamed for, or an incumbent might be able to do something with. And so there was a fair bit of talk in 2012 about the hurricane in New York, Hurricane Sandy, and how that sort of helped Obama. Not clear at all that it helped to me. The most common concern about October surprises are things that happen in foreign policy. And we actually have some pretty good evidence that would indicate what would happen if there actually were an October surprise. If it was very, very close to the election, it would be a benefit to the incumbent party and to the incumbent president. And that's because in public opinion, there's almost universally a rally around the flag phenomenon, that if the interests of the United States are sort of at stake, the voters tend to follow that with support for the president. That's why George W. Bush was over 90% approval after September 11th, 2001. If the October surprise was actually an August or a September surprise, it would work entirely the opposite. So as you get away from the initial event and the initial rally, and it becomes a more chronic problem, that would work to the disadvantage of the president. So a lot of it depends upon timing, and a lot of it depends upon kind of what's involved in that surprising event, particularly if it's a foreign policy event.
Yeah, Daryl Rowland from Columbus Dispatch. I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the negative ads. Probably just about everyone of us in here has covered a campaign, have heard the laments about negative advertising, and probably heard the reply, and perhaps made it ourselves that, well, the reason we see them is because they work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think probably the best supported claim or one of the best supported claims in a fairly large literature on the effect of campaign advertising on voter decision making is that negative ads are more informative than positive ads. The public itself will say that they don't like negative ads. There's a lot of criticism, certainly, of negative ads, and there's been dispute about what the effect is on things like turnout. But what is the case is that negative ads simply have a different character to them. And in fact, it's in part inherent to their being negative. Negative ads make comparisons. They basically tell you something either explicitly or implicitly about where the two candidates stand on issues, or the kind of the character of the two candidates, or what have you. It basically gives voters the kind of information they need. It's not whether one candidate is a good guy or not. Okay? It's about what the comparison is between candidate A and candidate B. And so because negative ads tend to involve comparisons, they are that much more effective in educating voters about the candidates, about the issues, and about what's at stake in the election.
I was just wondering if, given your lessons on timing and, given your lessons on just timing and voters being less apt to change their minds as time goes on, what sort of, I don't know, either prescriptions or lessons do you have for all of us who spend so much of our lives toiling away to get voters new information and storylines, particularly, of course, as we get to know candidates and they make more news? Is that, I don't know, disheartening and all for naught or something?
Well, I taught a presidential elections course in the fall of 2012. As you know, David Axelrod is right on our campus. And David gave an IOP event where he talked about the Obama campaign, and in particular, the strategy of the Obama campaign. And one of the claims that David made was that the crucial thing that the Obama campaign did was to go negative early with Romney during the summer and to help to kind of define Romney for the American voters. And that inspired me to ask a final exam question in my course, which was, if early information is sort of the most influential, if you like, or is likely to have the biggest impact, at least on the momentarily expressed preferences of the electorate, why is it that a huge fraction, much more than half of the total campaign spending occurs in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. So if that were the case, if you could actually sort of win the election in the summer, why wouldn't you put all your resources into the summer and sort of ride it out? Part of it is risk aversion. They're not willing to make that experiment. But part of it is that the reason why the new information is so much more influential early on is because there's nothing to kind of reinforce it, if you will, nothing to reinforce the kind of preferences that people have. By the end of the campaign, they have so much information, they have such an accumulation of information that a little bit might move them this way or that way, but it's basically, it would take something that's really, really, really distinctive and really, really, really different to make a very significant difference late in the campaign. Because by then, people have so much information that they either have the capacity to say, well, this just supports what I was already thinking, or the capacity to say, well, this is actually very much at variance with what I already know already. So it gives people the capacity to either sort of reinforce their predispositions at that point or their developed dispositions at that point, or to reject that information out of hand as inconsistent with those dispositions.
So reporters should get our stories done really early, basically? Move up the deadline?
Well, the other thing I would say about it, though, is that one of the things that's quite remarkable is that the polls are very, very valuable, sort of variable, but then they end up, the actual election ends up being in a fairly narrow range that turns out to be pretty predictable. The best election prediction models, by the way, can predict the final outcome with information known at the time of the conventions. From information known at the time of the conventions, it can predict the final outcome as well as the final polls, which is really extraordinary, right? So you have this big long campaign and there's lots of fluctuation, and then it comes down to this very narrow range of possible outcomes. But there's actually, people ask me, well, does that mean campaigns don't matter? Well, no. Campaigns matter because campaigns are smart, right? And so something will happen that looks damaging, and the campaign isn't going to stand there like a deer in the headlights. They're going to do something in response to it. The press is going to report something in response to it. And so it's actually the way that campaigns respond strategically to these events that actually helps to sort of bring things into the range that one would expect that they would be in. That it's the sort of charge and countercharge of the campaign that in essence gives the people the information they need to reach the decision that they're likely to make in the first place. So.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.